Lately, I've noticed something strange happening in my secular and progressive circles. An increasing number of friends spend almost their entire social media presence addressing MAGA supporters, but the math isn't quite mathing. First, why would they have so many MAGA followers in their feed to begin with? And second, if they don't, then who exactly are they talking to? At that point, it's not calling out anything. It's not persuasion. It's not activism. It's performance. It's beyond preaching to the choir. It's performing for the choir. So I started asking myself, am I oversimplifying this or is something deeper happening? Turns out it isn't oversimplification at all. What we're seeing is a genuine sociological pattern, one that doesn't just show up in conservative spaces or religious spaces, but apparently in secular atheist and humanist communities as well. And if we don't recognize it, we risk recreating the very behaviors we claim to have outgrown. Here's what's really happening underneath the surface. I get it. It feels like calling out MAGA, but the real audience is their own tribe. When someone's entire feed is built around calling out MAGA, but they don't actually have MAGA followers, aren't in dialogue with MAGA voters, and rarely share space with people on that end of the political spectrum, then the performance becomes obvious. The content isn't designed to persuade anyone who disagrees. It isn't even meant to reach the people being condemned. It's crafted for the people who already agree. This is the subtle shift where virtue signaling slips in. The message stops being, here's something dangerous we should address together, and becomes, watch me demonstrate my moral clarity in real time. The outrage is no longer aimed outward, it's aimed inward toward their own social group because the real purpose is to display alignment, loyalty, vigilance, and right. In these moments, the post isn't a warning, it's a badge. It's proof of awareness, proof of anger, proof of allegiance to the tribe's moral codes. And because the secular community, atheists, humanists, ex religious progressives, often defines itself in contrast to the perceived irrationality or extremism of religious conservatives, the signaling becomes a way to constantly reaffirm that identity. Without realizing it, they begin mirroring the very dynamics they once criticized in religious environments. You can almost see the unspoken script running beneath the surface. Look how attuned I am to injustice. Look how righteously outraged I remain. Look how faithfully I stand on the right side. This is a performance of virtue meant to reassure the group that the speaker still belongs, still sees the threat, and still carries the banner. Ironically, this is exactly the same kind of behavior that many secular individuals claim to have left behind when they walked away from the church. Public displays of moral positioning, crafted not to challenge outsiders, but to reassure insiders. Without realizing it, they've recreated the social rituals of religious identity inside a new ideological framework. They've replaced sanctified language with political language, replaced scripture with news headlines, and replaced testimonies with callouts. The form changed, the function didn't. And this is the key sociological point. What looks like resistance is often just a performance of belonging. The audience isn't the accused target, it's the approving crowd standing behind the performer. The second point here is that algorithms reward conflict, even imaginary conflict. The digital landscape is built on a simple truth: conflict travels farther than calm. Platforms are engineered to reward whatever keeps people clicking, sharing, and reacting, and nothing fuels that machine quite like outrage. So when someone posts, look at all these outrageous MAGA people doing X, Y, or Z, things that you already knew they were doing anyway, the algorithm immediately recognizes the emotional charge and gives it a boost, not because it's true or helpful or even meaningful, but because it's combustible. But here's where the dynamic becomes more complicated. Many people don't actually encounter MAGA supporters in their daily online interactions. Their feeds aren't full of conservatives. Their comment sections aren't overflowing with political opponents. So instead of responding to real conflict, they learn to manufacture it. They build a digital effigy, an imagined antagonist, so they can reenact the performance of standing up to a villain who isn't even in the room. The post then becomes a kind of staged battle where the audience already knows the lines and already agrees with the sentiment. It's not an attempt to confront misinformation or engage in opposing worldview. It's a reaffirmation ritual. The enemy is invoked the way a preacher invokes the devil, a symbolic figure whose presence justifies the community's unity and vigilance. This is how performative anti MAGA content thrives, even in spaces where no MAGA voices are actually present. The outrage isn't actually directed at conservatives, it's directed towards one's own social circle as evidence of continued awareness and continued moral alertness. It says, see, I'm still fighting, I'm still paying attention, I'm still loyal to the cause. The conflict is less a political act and more a kind of performance art that exists to reassure the audience of the performer's righteousness. In essence, people learn to keep the antagonist alive because the antagonist keeps the engagement alive. And once that happens, the behavior shifts from activism to theatrics, which I'm not interested in. The moral stance becomes less about resisting harm and more about demonstrating virtue through the illusion of confrontation. The irony is that in a space where no real battle is occurring, the person still feels compelled to show their allies that they're fighting. And that is the clearest mark of virtue signaling, the performance of resistance in the absence of a present opponent. Number three, it becomes a way to perform intelligence, morality, and vigilance. Over time, this kind of performative outrage evolves into something even more subtle, a way to signal intelligence, morality, and vigilance. Within secular communities, especially among atheist, humanist, and politically progressive spaces, there is often an unspoken expectation that the informed person is the virtuous person. Being politically aware becomes a kind of social currency, proof that someone is enlightened, conscientious, and alert to danger. In that environment, calling out MAGA isn't just a reaction to political events, it becomes a shorthand for one's entire moral and intellectual posture. A person can demonstrate that they are sharp enough to recognize threats, educated enough to cite the latest outrage, and committed enough to remain perpetually enraged on behalf of the community. It becomes a performance of competence wrapped inside a performance of conscience. What makes this especially appealing is that it offers all the psychological benefits of activism without requiring any of the substantive work. One post can grant a person moral credibility. I'm on the right side. It gives them social capital. My people see me and they approve. It anchors their identity. This is who I am and what I stand against. It reinforces belonging. I'm still one of you. And it creates the comforting illusion of usefulness. I did something today, even when nothing material has changed or nothing actually got done. In this sense, secular spaces begin to mimic the emotional architecture of religion. The callouts function like a digital liturgy, a repeated ritual that reaffirms community values and the moral worth of the individual performing it. It's the non religious equivalent of saying thoughts and prayers, except here the prayer is outrage and the offering is a screenshot. The refrain becomes, look at how loudly I yelled at MAGA today, as if volume were a proxy for virtue. But the louder the performance, the clearer it becomes that the real goal isn't to challenge the political landscape, it's to maintain one's status within the community. The outrage becomes less about change and more about confirmation of intelligence, confirmation of vigilance, confirmation of moral purity. In the end, the performance says far more about the audience than it ever does about the supposed target. And that's where the secular community must be honest with itself. Sometimes the performance is not a protest, but a plea. See me, approve of me, recognize me, recognize me as one of the good ones, please. Which leads us to number four. It's a coping mechanism for powerlessness. There's another layer to this behavior that often goes unspoken, but sits at the heart of why it spreads so easily. When people feel politically overwhelmed, socially disempowered, or cut off from any real ability to influence policy or shift their immediate environment, they begin to reach for whatever outlet gives them a sense of agency. And in a world where so much feels immovable, symbolic action becomes the natural substitute for material action. In other words, tokenism becomes more important than taking action. Calling out MAGA online is symbolic. It doesn't change an election alter legislation, reshape policing, or shift public school curricula, but it does offer something that feels like momentum. It gives the illusion of participation while not actually having to participate. It lets a person believe they're still in the fight, still alert, still present in the struggle, even if only through a screen. Material action, on the other hand, is demanding. Organizing takes time. Showing up takes courage. Building coalition, influencing local politics, nurturing community change, these require patience, strategy, and a willingness to deal with the slowness and messiness of real transformation. Symbolic action is immediate, material action is long term. The former offers emotional release, the latter requires emotional endurance. So people drift towards the thing that feels more accessible. Their social media feed becomes a pressure valve. It becomes the place where they can unload the frustration of living in a system they can't directly control. The internal narrative becomes, I can't change the system, but I can express my outrage. And for a moment, that expression feels like movement. This creates a cycle. The more powerless someone feels, the more symbolic their activism becomes. The more symbolic their activism becomes, the less they engage in anything that would genuinely shift power. Outrage becomes a coping mechanism, not a catalyst. It relieves pressure without redirecting it toward actual change. And in that shift from material engagement to symbolic display, the secular community risks confusing release with progress, mistaking noise for influence, and allowing a gesture to stand in for the work. Which leads us to number 5. This is the problem. It creates echo chamber adrenaline rather than actual collective progress. The real danger in all of this is that it produces something that feels like momentum, but never actually moves anything. Instead of building collective progress, the behavior creates what you could call echo chamber adrenaline, a rush that comes from being loudly affirmed by people who already agree. It's intoxicating, but it's empty. I asked an important question earlier. Who is this actually for? Because if the only people seeing or interacting with these posts are people who already share the same outrage, then the performance isn't activism, it's reinforcement. It's a ritual of reassurance, a way for the group to congratulate itself on its clarity without confronting the reality that no one outside the circle is listening. Inside that closed loop, a certain set of psychological patterns begin to take over. People start performing for their audience rather than engaging with the world. Outrage becomes a kind of social currency, and each post becomes an audition for approval. It's kind of sickening when you think about it. The likes and comments create dopamine bursts that reward the performance, making it easier to repeat the behavior and harder to step back and assess what it's actually accomplishing. Over time, this environment encourages tribal policing, people watching one another for signs of insufficient anger or imperfect messaging. It encourages performative anger because emotion reads better on the algorithm than nuance. It encourages shallow engagement where people respond to headlines and vibes rather than digging into policy, strategy, or community solutions, which are the most important. And eventually, it produces emotional burnout where the constant cycle of outrage leaves people exhausted, cynical, and convinced that nothing can ever improve, which finalizes your futility. Worst of all, these performance cycles often end up replacing the forms of engagement that actually matter. Real organizing requires collaboration, listening, and long term commitment. Real coalition building requires humility and a willingness to build bridges with people who don't already agree. Real political strategy requires discipline. Real conversations with persuadable moderates require patience. All of this is harder than posting. All of it is slower. None of it generates instant applause, so the performance becomes the substitute, and the movement loses the muscle it needs to make actual change. That's why this behavior bothers me, not because it's annoying or overdone, which it is both, but because I can feel the hollowness at the center of it. The energy is loud, but it lacks depth. The passion is real, but it has no direction. The anger is justified, but it seems to be purposefully unproductive. And underneath it all is the uncomfortable truth. People feel more empowered performing the idea of resistance than participating in the work of transformation. So, no, I'm not oversimplifying this. What we're seeing is a cluster of intertwined behaviors that reveal far more about the people posting than the targets they claim to be calling out. At its core, this pattern is driven by the need to signal virtue, to demonstrate alignment, and to publicly affirm one's place within a moral tribe. It's shaped by the incentives of the platforms we use, which reward outrage and polarization more than nuance or thoughtful engagement. We're also noticing the way identity gets performed online, how the absence of real political opponents leads people to manufacture symbolic enemies just to keep the performance going. We're seeing how symbolic activism replaces material activism, how emotional expression gets outsourced to the internet instead of channeled into real world change. And beneath it all, we're recognizing something deeply ironic. Secular spaces often reproduce the same social behaviors that define religious communities: ritualized outrage, coded language, public declarations of moral purity, and the constant need to reassure the group that you still belong. My instinct here is absolutely correct. Most of these posts are not really about MAGA at all. MAGA is just the canvas. The real subject is the self, the real audience is the tribe, and the real purpose is belonging, affirmation, identity maintenance, and the comfort of knowing that one's moral standing is intact with the community. What looks like resistance is often reassurance. What looks like activism is frequently performance. And what looks like a political stance is at heart a social ritual. We're not imagining that, we're naming it. It's crucial for us to recognize and interrupt this pattern early, because when secular and humanist communities slip into the performative outrage, they unintentionally recreate the very dynamics they claim they've out. The moment the movement turns outward expression into its primary metric of moral worth, it starts acting less like a philosophical project and more like a stage play, full of dramatic gestures but empty of real transformation. And I encourage you, point me to the real transformation if I have missed it. The first problem is that spectacle begins to replace substance. People start pouring their emotional energy into visible indignation rather than meaningful work. The time and attention that could fuel organizing, education, community building, or policy engagement gets swallowed up by the constant need to perform anger for the algorithm. This creates a dangerous illusion. The community feels active, but nothing is actually happening. The emotional intensity tricks people into believing progress is being made, when in reality, all that's being produced is content. This leads to a second distortion: the belief that expression equals effectiveness. In this environment, saying something becomes synonymous with doing something. Venting then is mistaken for strategy. Public declarations are confused with actual change. People start to believe that posting about an issue is equivalent to confronting it. And once symbolic action becomes the norm, material action becomes rare. The movement becomes loud but not strong, visible but not impactful. The third issue strikes at the heart of what secularism and humanism are supposed to represent. These traditions pride themselves on clearer thinking, ethical consistency, and evidence based reasoning. They aspire to build healthier communities, reduce harm, and model a world rooted in human dignity rather than dogma. But when virtue signaling outrage takes center stage, all of that gets pushed aside. The community becomes inward facing, obsessed with its own moral performance instead of outward facing and committed to real change. The moral economy turns performative, rewarding those who signal the loudest rather than those who work the hardest or think the most critically. If this continues unchallenged, secular spaces risk devolving into ideological theaters, places where people gather to reenact the same predictable scripts of outrage, affirmation, and applause, rather than places of genuine inquiry, growth, and collective action. Philosophical homes become stages, communities become audiences, and the movement loses the integrity that once made it a meaningful alternative to religious or ideological conformity. That's why this must be addressed immediately. Not because outrage is wrong, but because performance without purpose is a slow erosion of everything secular humanism claims to stand for. From a sociological perspective, this kind of performative outrage costs secularism and humanism far more than most people are willing to acknowledge or admit. The damage is subtle at first, almost invisible, because the community feels active, passionate, and engaged. Beneath that surface energy, something corrosive begins to take shape. The first loss is credibility. When secular individuals spend more time showcasing their outrage than proposing solutions or engaging in meaningful dialogue, they begin to mimic the very tribal behaviors they critique in fundamentalist communities. The distinction between thoughtful critique and reactive hostility blurs. Outsiders looking in struggle to tell whether these are people committed to reason and evidence or simply people angry about different things. When secularism starts to feel synonymous with cynicism, negativity, and moral grandstanding, its cultural appeal shrinks. It loses its claim to be a rational alternative, instead becomes another ideological battleground or another white man, woman haters, he man, boys club. This feeds directly into a second consequence, an erosion of social trust. A steady stream of symbolic outrage signals to the public that the secular spaces may be volatile, reactionary, or more interested in winning arguments than building relationships. This is true. Humanism, by definition, should be the most rational philosophy of all, but symbolic outrage sends the opposite message. If secular communities appear just as combative and insular as the religious environments people are trying to escape, they forfeit the moral high ground. They cease to feel like a refuge. The third cost is internal fragmentation. Performative virtue signaling inevitably creates a culture of policing, people watching one another for signs of insufficient anger or improper language. Suddenly, the focus shifts from ideas to optics, from dialogue to discipline. The boundaries of acceptability tighten. The community becomes brittle, homogenous, and tense. Instead of welcoming diverse secular thinkers, the movement begins to shrink into an echo chamber where only one tone, one posture, and one emotional register are allowed. This leads to a decline in political effectiveness, as we've seen. Successful movements depend on coalition building, strategic engagement, and the ability to reach people who don't already agree. But virtue signaling rewards purity over persuasion. It pushes people towards performance of righteousness rather than efforts to build bridges or craft long term strategies. The result is predictable. Secular spaces become loud online, but ineffective offline. They generate heat, but have no power. There's also a psychological toll. When people cycle through constant symbolic outrage without any material wins to anchor that energy, they eventually burn out. Fatigue sets in, cynicism expands, hope drains away, and what began as activism turns into despair dressed up as engagement. Over time, outrage becomes the culture itself, not a response to external conditions. And movements historically do not collapse from being outnumbered, they collapse from internal exhaustion. But perhaps the most damaging cost of all is the alienation of the very people secularism hopes to reach. Many individuals leave religion because they're tired of moral grandstanding, purity tests, sanctimony, and us versus them rhetoric. They come seeking something more mature, more grounded, and more human. When they encounter secular spaces that reproduce the same patterns in different language, they walk right back out. They don't reject the ideas, they reject the culture, as they should. Not because secularism has failed intellectually, but because it's failed socially. In the end, the tragedy is that secularism and humanism have everything they need to build vibrant, inclusive, courageous communities. But performative outrage quietly siphons away that potential, replacing depth with display, strategy with spectacle, and connection with conformity. It doesn't just weaken the movement, it reshapes it into something unrecognizable from the very values it claims to embody. The bottom line is this: the cost of performative outrage isn't merely about tone or optics, it isn't just an aesthetic problem, it is existential. When secular spaces begin to mirror the emotional economy of fundamentalism, using outrage as a bonding ritual, turning enemies into content, and allowing performance to harden into identity, then the entire project of secular humanism is quietly undermined from within. The movement loses the very qualities that once made it a genuine alternative: clarity, courage, openness, intellectual rigor, and a commitment to human flourishing. A community cannot build liberation on the scaffolding of the spectacle of futility. It cannot preach critical thinking while rewarding conformity. It cannot claim to rise above dogma while replicating the same moral theatrics in a different vocabulary. If secular spaces do not recognize what is happening and actively push against it, they will remain stuck in the emotional loops of the systems they thought they had left behind. This is why counteracting virtue signaling isn't optional. It's not about shaming individuals or policing expression. It's about protecting the integrity of the movement itself. It's about ensuring that secular humanism doesn't devolve into another echo chamber where people perform enlightenment rather than actually practice it. The work of identifying and interrupting these patterns is survival work. It is the difference between a movement that becomes another tribal identity and one that remains a rigorous, compassionate, transformative force in the world. If secular humanism is to have a future worthy of its ideals, it must guard itself against the temptation of performance and recommit itself to the difficult, disciplined, and deeply human work of real change. Listen, I'm not just a creator of content, I am a cultivator of community. I'm more interested in building solutions for humanity than I am in making a name for myself or rubbing elbows with the voices of atheism past. The work that I do focuses on helping people find clarity in this great big ball of confusion and come to some conclusion that leads to their contribution to humanity's continued rise from the ashes of our own ignorance. I am committed to helping communities convert curiosity into comprehension and comprehension into effective calls to action and calls to connect. In less than 2 years, we built a global community with an undeniable global reach. Just imagine how much more we could accomplish with your support. And Bridge City is only the beginning, a connected community that becomes the catalyst for so much more. We have ambitions and aspirations to positively impact the issues of economics, education, and even entertainment, all in the pursuit of the continued evolution of our humanity. We are solving problems and generating opportunity at the same time. And today, I'm inviting you to get off the sidelines and get involved. Become a financial supporter or join the Bridge City Global Campus today to escape the matrix and start making a difference with people just like you in real time. As usual, the links are in the description below. Thank you for hanging out with me today, and until next time, keep rising.